You know that feeling? When good enough just doesn't feel right at work. That constant nagging thought that, like, every single detail needs to be perfect, even when it feels maybe a bit much. It can really leave you feeling wound up, like you can never properly switch off.
Oh, absolutely. That really hits home for so many driven people. And today we're diving right into that connection between perfectionism and workaholism. But there's a twist. The research we looked at offers a really fascinating angle on how that drive can actually work for us, not against us.
Exactly. We've been digging deep into this paper. It's called Breaking Free from the Perfection Trap: Is Excellence Seeking an Antidote to Perfectionism-Induced Workaholism? By Coley and colleagues. And yeah, that title really nails what we're exploring. Is there actually a way to be super ambitious, successful without getting stuck in that burnout cycle of workaholism that's fueled by needing everything to be flawless?
Right. And our mission sort of in this deep dive is trying to uncover that healthier path. Can we channel ambition differently? Maybe reduce the pressure instead of piling it on? We really want you, the listener, to get that crucial difference between striving for excellence, aiming high, sure, but realistically and demanding absolute, often unattainable perfection. Because understanding that, well, it could fundamentally change your work habits and honestly your overall well being. So let's get into it. What does the research actually say? How are perfectionism and excellencism different?
Okay, so the paper, and it draws on a lot of previous work here, defines perfectionism as rooted in this deep need for complete faultlessness. It's very all of nothing, a relentless chase for flawlessness, setting standards that are often, excessively high, almost impossible sometimes. And there's usually a big element of really critical self-evaluation tied to hitting those perfect outcome standards.
Mm.
That inner critic is just
Yeah.
relentless.
Yeah, that sounds so familiar. That little voice saying, nope, not quite right yet, even on tiny things. And the researchers, they focus on a specific kind of perfectionism here, don't they?
They do, yes. The core of it is what they call personal standards perfectionism, or PSP. That's really about the individual's internal drive for those perfect results.
Okay, PSP. Got it. The drive for a flawless end product. So how does this idea of excellencism stack up against that? What's the contrast?
Right. So excellencism, as they define it, also involves aiming high, striving for significant standards. But, and this is really key, these standards are seen as attainable. It's pursued with effort, yeah, and engagement, determination, but also, crucially, with flexibility. Unlike perfectionists, these excellence seekers aren't quite so burdened by excessive worries about uncertainty or what others think, or tying their self-worth directly to hitting that perfect mark every single time.
That flexibility bit sounds like a real game changer. So where the perfectionist is maybe tunnel visioned on that one perfect result, the excellence seeker is more open to the process, to learning as they go.
Exactly that. The research suggests perfection seekers often get kind of bogged down, exhaustive effort, incredibly long hours trying to reach something that might not even be reachable. Excellence seekers, though, they tend to focus more on continuous learning, refining things, making progress. It's not always about some mythical perfect endpoint.
Right, a different focus entirely. Now, this paper doesn't just pluck these ideas out of thin air, does it? It connects to what we already sort of know about perfectionism leading to, well, some pretty unhealthy work habits, workaholism specifically.
Precisely. The study mentions the classic definition of workaholism, that uncontrollable need to just work constantly. And yeah, previous research has shown pretty strong links. Perfectionism is often a really strong predictor of workaholism. There's quite a bit of evidence suggesting that drive for perfection leads to working excessively.
So that perfection trap they talk about in the title, it really can lead people down that path of working way too much, way too intensely. And it's not just the long hours, is it? There are other downsides.
Oh, absolutely. The paper notes that this relentless perfectionism can contribute to a whole range of issues, not just workaholism, really hitting overall well-being. And this study specifically wanted to look at how that personal drive for perfect standards, that PSP, influences the two main parts of workaholism. Working excessively, meaning just the sheer volume of hours, and working compulsively, that feeling like you just have to be working.
Okay, so that's what they were looking at. How did they actually investigate it? What was the method?
They use something called a person-centered analysis, specifically a technique known as latent profile analysis. It's a really neat approach because instead of just averaging everyone together, it helps identify distinct groups of people who share similar patterns across perfectionism, excellencism, and workaholism. They studied two different samples, one group of corporate professionals and another of academics, over 1,000 people altogether.
Ah, okay. So rather than just looking at overall trends, they were trying to find if there were different types of people within these jobs based on these traits, and did they find distinct types?
They did, yeah. The analysis really supported the idea of different profiles. They found three main groups, which actually lines up with some earlier work. First, you had the non-perfectionists, pretty much low across the board, low perfectionism, low excellencism, low workaholism. Then the excellence seekers. These folks were high on excellencism, but low to moderate on perfectionism. And finally, the perfection seekers. They scored high on perfectionism and, crucially, high on both parts of workaholism, working excessively and working compulsively.
Wow. Okay, those three profiles are pretty clear. So how did belonging to one of these profiles link up with workaholism in the real world, the corporate and academic settings?
The results were quite revealing. For the non-perfectionists in both groups, they reported working excessively less often. Makes sense. And in the academic sample, they also showed less compulsive working. So lower overall drive tended to mean less intense work habits. Not a huge surprise there.
Right, that tracks. But the other two groups, the driven ones, that's where it gets really interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is the core finding, really. The excellence seekers, while in the academic group, they showed a lower tendency to work excessively. But even more striking, across both the corporate and academic samples, they had a significantly reduced likelihood of working compulsively.
That's huge. So these are highly driven people aiming high, but they're not getting sucked into that feeling of, I must be working all the time.
Hmm.
Okay, and the perfection seekers, how did they fare?
Well, for the perfection seekers, the pattern was consistent and concerning. High levels of both excessive and compulsive working in both samples. It really drives home the point. Striving for perfection seems tightly linked to workaholism, but striving for excellence, even though it involves high standards, doesn't seem to carry that same compulsive burden.
Wow. So the big takeaway feels like shifting towards excellence seeking could actually protect against those unhealthy workaholic patterns while perfectionism kind of feeds them.
That's exactly it. And the researchers make another really important point about how they compared these groups, which adds another layer of insight.
Oh, go on. What was special about the comparison?
Well, often studies might compare perfectionists just to people who aren't perfectionists, like the non-perfectionist group here. But this study specifically used excellence seeking as the main comparison point for perfection seeking.
Okay. Why does that specific comparison matter so much?
Because if you only compare perfectionism to, say, not being driven at all, you might wrongly think, oh, perfectionism must be good because these people achieve a lot. But comparing it directly to another form of high-striving excellencism gives you a much clearer, more valid picture of the unique impact of each approach. You're comparing like with like in terms of ambition level.
Ah, I see. Right. It's not just driven versus not driven. It's about the kind of drive. And they found that only the excellence seekers saw that actual drop in compulsive work habits. The non-perfectionists were just low to begin with, but the excellence seekers actively showed less compulsion. That really makes excellencism sound like that potential antidote the title mentions.
Exactly. It suggests you can be ambitious, you can achieve great things without necessarily paying the price in terms of compulsive work habits if you cultivate that excellence mindset. And this actually leads into another cool concept the paper touches on this idea of diminishing marginal returns.
Okay, diminishing returns. Tell me more. How does that apply here?
So the paper mentions this too much of a good thing effect, or TMGT. The idea is that some things are good up to a point, but then become detrimental. With perfectionism, the suggestion is that pushing beyond a certain point, chasing that absolute flawlessness, actually starts to give you negative results, like increased workaholism. It's like there are increasing marginal risks. You pour in more and more effort for less and less real benefit, and it actually starts to harm you.
So pushing for that absolute perfection eventually backfires, leading to these unhealthy patterns. How does excellencism fit into that picture? Does it have the same issue?
Well, the findings here suggest probably not. Because excellencism was linked to a reduction in compulsive work, it implies that striving for high but attainable standards doesn't seem to carry that same risk of spiraling downwards. It looks like a more sustainable, healthier way to be ambitious.
It feels like such a critical point for you listening right now, especially if you're someone who really wants to learn, achieve, do well, but you're also trying hard to avoid that constant feeling of being overwhelmed or burnt out. What's the kind of practical takeaway here?
I think the most actionable insight is this. Consciously trying to shift your focus away from needing flawless perfection and towards pursuing high, yes, but realistic goals. That's the core of excellencism. Doing that could genuinely lead to a better work-life balance and really lower your risk of workaholism.
So it's about valuing the journey, right? The continuous improvement, the progress, rather than fixating only on some potentially impossible perfect destination. Sounds like it could take a lot of the anxiety out of it too.
Absolutely. And the research kind of hints that the motivation behind excellencism is likely more internal, more autonomous. It comes from wanting genuine growth and competence, which tends to foster a much healthier relationship with work overall.
Okay, so wrapping this up, the big picture seems to be really understanding that vital difference between demanding perfection and striving for excellence.
Hmm.
And this research gives some pretty strong evidence that leaning into that excellence-seeking approach could be a powerful way to break out of that perfection trap and keep workaholism in check.
Exactly. Setting high standards isn't the problem. It's the nature of those standards. Are they achievable and flexible, or are they rigid, maybe even irrational? And how flexible are you in pursuing them? That seems to be what makes all the difference for your well-being.
So maybe here's a thought to leave you with. Take a moment to consider the areas in your own life, maybe work, maybe elsewhere, where you might be demanding perfection instead of striving for excellence. What's one small shift, maybe just one thing you could try today, to embrace progress over that need for flawless outcomes? Just notice how might that start to change your relationship with your work and maybe even just how you feel day to day.
It really does come down to that self-reflection, doesn't it? Just examining your own tendencies and maybe digging a bit deeper into these ideas of perfectionism versus excellencism could be really insightful for how you approach your goals and manage your energy.